The mercenary leader's growl echoed through the small room as he stepped closer, his massive frame blocking the only exit. Daniel quickly assessed the situation. They couldn't fight this behemoth head-on. He needed a plan, and fast. "Get back," Daniel shouted to Nyara. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back door, his mind working in overdrive. The mercenary leader was too big to chase them through the narrow corridors of the outpost, but they had to escape quickly, or they were both dead. Nyara stumbled behind him, her heart racing, but she didn't question his actions. She trusted him, the soldier who had once saved her life. Even now, with their lives on the line, she could feel the pull of that connection. The hallway was narrow, cluttered with old supplies, but it led to a hidden escape hatch, one Daniel had known about from his time working here. He pulled the hatch open, revealing a dark tunnel, and motioned for Nyara to go first. "Go," he ordered, his voice tense. Nyara didn't hesitate. She crawled through the hatch, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, Daniel was still watching the door, ensuring they wouldn't be followed. Just as she reached the end of the tunnel, she heard footsteps, heavy and fast. Daniel was behind her, but he wasn't far enough ahead. The leader's voice roared, "They're trying to escape. Cut them off." Nyara pushed herself forward, her breath coming in short bursts. There was no time. They had to reach the ship. The tunnel opened up to the edge of the colony, where the transport ship sat waiting, small and unassuming, but their only chance of survival. Daniel caught up with her, his breathing steady, but his eyes alert. "I'm going to cover you," he said, looking toward the open space between them. "And the ship. You run, and don't look back." Nyara nodded, the words too difficult to speak. She didn't want to run. Not again. But this was their only shot. With a final glance, Daniel moved into position, taking up a spot near the entrance to the colony. He aimed his blaster rifle at the approaching mercenaries, firing a few warning shots. "Run," Daniel shouted. Nyara didn't wait. She sprinted across the open space, her legs moving faster than she thought possible. The wind whipped against her face, and the sounds of gunfire filled the air behind her, but she didn't stop. She reached the transport ship and jumped inside, quickly starting the engines. The ship rumbled to life beneath her, and she glanced back just in time to see Daniel sprint toward her, the mercenaries hot on his heels. Come on," Nyara muttered, her hands flying over the controls. Daniel reached the ship just as the first shot slammed into the ground beside him. He jumped inside, and the hatch slammed shut behind him. The ship shot into the air with a loud roar, leaving the colony behind. For a moment, they were safe, but Nyara knew this was just the beginning. The mercenaries wouldn't stop, and whoever was behind this chase was not going to let them go easily. Daniel slumped in his seat, wiping the sweat from his brow. That was too close. Nyara looked out the window, watching as the colony disappeared into the distance. "We're not out of danger yet." "I know," Daniel said, his eyes hardening. "But we're not alone anymore. And I won't let anyone take you." Nyara looked at him, gratitude filling her heart. She didn't know where they were headed next, but for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. The ship's interior vibrated with the force of each enemy blast, rattling the walls and shaking the seats. Daniel's eyes flickered between the controls and the ships closing in on them. Every move had to be calculated. Every second mattered. If they didn't escape now, they wouldn't get another chance. Nyara gripped the laser blaster tightly, her knuckles white. "How long can we keep dodging them?" she asked, her voice tense but steady. Daniel's jaw clenched as he maneuvered the ship into another evasive roll, narrowly avoiding another round of enemy fire. "Not long. We need backup." She could see the determination in his eyes. He was trying to hold it together, but even he knew that a fight like this couldn't be won alone. Nyara glanced out the view window, her mind racing. There had to be someone who could help. They couldn't rely on luck forever, and Daniel's skills, impressive as they were weren't enough against this kind of force. Daniel, we need to contact your old allies, the ones from your past, she said, her voice firm with purpose. Daniel's eyes flicked to her for a brief moment, a flicker of hesitation. You're suggesting I call in favors from people who might be just as dangerous as the ones chasing us. I'm suggesting we're out of options, Nayara countered. If we don't act now, we won't have a future to worry about. Daniel hesitated for a moment longer, then gave a sharp nod. All right, you're right. With a sigh, he typed in a series of commands on the console, connecting to a secure channel. This is Daniel Carter, calling in a favor. There was a brief moment of silence before a voice crackled through the speakers, sharp and gruff. Carter, I thought you disappeared off the map. What's this about? It's about survival, old friend, Daniel said quickly. I'm on Titan's edge, and I need your help. I've got a bounty on my head. And now, I've got someone with me who's even more of a target. Nayara couldn't help but listen closely, her heart pounding. She didn't know who this person was, but she hoped they could help them escape this nightmare. Who's the target? The voice asked, clearly skeptical. Nayara stepped forward, stepping into the line of communication. My name is Nayara. I'm the heir to the Zyrenian throne. There was a long pause, followed by a low whistle. The heir, ha. Well, that's a little more than I was expecting. You've got more enemies than I thought, Carter. I know, Daniel replied. But we're running out of time. We need to get to the old military station near the edge of the system, and we need help getting past the mercenaries. Another long pause followed. Then, the voice on the other end finally spoke again, a hint of a smile in their tone. You're lucky you called me, Carter. I'll have a ship on the way. But don't think for a second you're off the hook. We've got a lot of debts to settle. Don't worry, Daniel said, his voice determined. I'll settle them. As the connection was cut, Nayara felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They had backup, and that meant they had a fighting chance. Daniel turned to her, his expression more focused than ever. We've got a window, but we have to move fast. The mercenaries won't stop, and we're not out of danger yet. Nayara nodded. She was ready. They had allies coming, but it was still going to be a dangerous fight. But for the first time since they'd started running, she felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't alone anymore. The ship rumbled softly as it glided through the blackness of space, leaving the colony far behind. For the first time since the chase began, Nayara allowed herself to relax. Her heart was still racing, but she had to admit, she felt a strange sense of safety with Daniel at her side. Sitting beside the pilot's console, Daniel was quiet, his fingers drumming lightly on the metal surface as he stared ahead. He hadn't said much since they escaped, and Nayara could tell something was weighing on him. She glanced at him. Are you okay? Daniel didn't immediately respond. Instead, he stared at the star map displayed on the ship's screen, his mind clearly miles away. You've changed, she said softly, trying to ease the tension in the air. You're not the same man I remember. Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't like talking about the past, especially not the war. I'm not, he finally muttered. The war changes people. Nayara watched him closely, then leaned forward slightly. I know that better than anyone. Daniel turned his gaze to her, meeting her eyes for the first time since they'd boarded the ship. For a moment, they just stared at each other, both with their own scars, their own burdens. I never wanted to be a part of all of this, Daniel said, his voice low. I was just a soldier doing my job, but when I found you, it changed everything. Nayara felt a lump form in her throat. She had often wondered about him, about the soldier who had saved her life, carrying her through the battlefield, risking everything for a stranger. But she had never asked why. What happened to you after? She asked gently. Why did you disappear? Daniel's expression darkened as he leaned back in his seat. I couldn't stay after that mission. The military didn't want me anymore, and I wasn't much for settling down anyway. He paused, rubbing his neck. I just left. I thought it was better that way. Nayara absorbed his words, understanding more now than ever. He hadn't just abandoned her. He had abandoned everyone, including himself. The weight of war had consumed him, just like it had so many others. But why did you save me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What was so special about me? Daniel exhaled, his gaze hardening again. I don't know. You were just a kid, caught in something that wasn't your fault. And I couldn't leave you behind. But you weren't just some helpless child. You were different. Nayara was quiet, staring at him, trying to understand. How was I different? Daniel leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers. You had the look of someone important. You weren't just any refugee. I didn't know it at the time, but I knew that one day you would be something bigger than either of us could imagine. Nayara swallowed hard, her breath catching in her chest. He had known. Somehow, even then, he had known that she wasn't just a survivor. She was the heir to a throne. Her thoughts spiraled. What had happened to her homeworld? How had things gotten so bad? And who was hunting her now? Now you know, she said quietly, her voice shaky. I'm not just some lost girl. I'm the heir to this Iranian throne, and the people after me want to see me dead. Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, his eyes softened. I figured something like that. But no matter who's after you, I'll keep you safe. I gave you my word before, and I'll keep it. Nayara felt a strange warmth fill her chest at his words. In that moment, with all the danger surrounding them, she realized something. He hadn't just saved her once. He had saved her again. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe they could make it. The dusty wind howled across the barren plains as Nayara walked toward the old outpost beyond the city walls. The journey was long, the night cold, but she didn't stop. She had spent years searching for this man. She wouldn't turn back now. Her mind raced with questions. Would he remember her? Would he even care? The outpost was small, built from rusted metal and stone, barely standing against the harsh winds of this distant world. It looked abandoned, but Nayara knew better. Humans were survivors. If he was here, he wouldn't be easy to find. She stepped closer, her boots crunching against the dry ground. A single light flickered in one of the windows, a sign of life. Taking a deep breath, she raised her hand and knocked on the metal door. Silence. Then, the sound of footsteps. The door creaked open slightly, revealing a pair of sharp, tired human eyes. What do you want? The man's voice was rough, guarded. Nayara's heart skipped a beat. It was him. She pulled down her hood, revealing her Iranian features, violet skin, silver markings along her temples. His eyes widened slightly, recognition flickering in them, but he said nothing. You are Daniel Carter, she said, her voice steady but soft. You saved my life. Years ago. Do you remember? Daniel stared at her for a long moment. His face was older now, a rough beard covering his jaw, scars lining his skin. He had seen too much, lost too much. Finally, he exhaled. I remember, he admitted, his voice lower now. You were just a kid. Nayara felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. He remembered, but there was no warmth in his voice. He didn't seem happy to see her. I've been looking for you, she continued. I needed to find you. Too. Thank you. Daniel sighed, stepping back. You shouldn't have come here, he muttered. Whatever you think I am. I'm not that man anymore. Before Nayara could reply, a sudden explosion echoed in the distance. The ground trembled beneath them. Daniel's instincts kicked in instantly. He grabbed Nayara's arm and pulled her inside, slamming the door shut. Tell me the truth, he said, his eyes sharp. Who's after you? Nayara swallowed hard. I don't know, but they've been following me since I started searching for you. Daniel cursed under his breath. Then you just led them right to me. Outside, heavy footsteps approached. The night was no longer quiet. The past was no longer buried. And now, They were both in danger. The distant glow of the colony's spaceport flickered against the cold darkness of space as Nayara stepped off the transport ship. Her heart pounded in her chest as she adjusted the hood of her cloak, hiding her alien features from the curious eyes around her. She had waited years for this moment, for this search to finally lead her here. A human colony on the edge of civilized space, a place where people vanished, where the past could be buried. But she had no intention of forgetting. Nayara took a deep breath, clutching the small holographic device in her hand. With a press of a button, the image of a man flickered to life. A soldier, human, standing in battle-worn armor. His face was hardened, yet his eyes had once shown her kindness, something she had never forgotten. She had been just a child when he saved her. A war had raged across her homeworld, and she had been caught in the crossfire. He was the one who pulled her from the rubble, who carried her to safety. But before she could thank him, before she could even remember his name, he was gone. Now she was here to find him. Nayara approached a dimly lit cantina, the kind of place where people talked if you asked the right questions or paid enough credits. She stepped inside, the scent of burning fuel and alien spices filling the air. A few heads turned toward her, some with curiosity, others with suspicion. She walked to the counter and leaned in toward the bartender, a burly human with cybernetic implants. "I'm looking for someone," she said in a steady voice. "A human soldier. He served in the Zyrenian War, years ago." The bartender raised an eyebrow. "A lot of soldiers passed through that war, lady. You'll need to be more specific." She hesitated, then placed a silver token on the counter, one of the last things she had from the day of her rescue. "He gave me this." The bartender picked it up, his eyes narrowing as he turned it over. His expression changed slightly. "Recognition. You're looking for Daniel Carter." Her breath caught. Daniel. She finally had a name. "Where is he?" she asked quickly. The bartender hesitated, glancing around before leaning in. "He doesn't go by that name anymore, but you'll find him in the old outpost beyond the city walls." Nayara nodded, slipping the token back into her pocket. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the cantina, her determination stronger than ever. The search was over. She had finally found him. But would he remember her? Would he even want to see her again? As she stepped into the cool night, she had no idea that others were watching her, and that danger was closer than she thought. The ship's engines sputtered and died as they entered the hangar bay, the heavy doors slamming shut behind them with a loud thud. The once distant military station now stood as their only hope. Daniel took a deep breath, finally allowing himself a moment of relief. They had made it inside, but that didn't mean they were safe. Nayara quickly unstrapped herself from her seat, her heart still racing. She glanced over at Daniel, who was already moving to check the ship's systems, ensuring everything was secure. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few hours. "We're not done yet," Daniel said, his voice low but steady. He walked toward the back of the ship, scanning the hangar through the small window. "I'll take a look around, see if we can find any way out of here in case they follow us." Nayara nodded but didn't move. She felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. They had narrowly escaped the mercenaries, but she knew better than to think the danger was over. There was still so much they didn't know. Who exactly was after her? What did they want with her? Daniel turned back to her. "Stay here. I'll be quick." He stepped out of the ship and into the cold, dimly lit hangar. The station was old, abandoned after the war. Rusted walls lined the corridor, and the eerie silence gave it an almost haunted feel. Yet, in the distance, the low hum of power systems and old equipment still worked, enough to keep the station running for a few more hours, maybe days. Nayara waited in the ship, eyes flickering between the radar and the door. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, that the mercenaries weren't the only threat on this station. She had to be ready. Outside, Daniel was moving swiftly through the station's corridors. The old systems weren't easy to navigate, but he had trained in places like this. His eyes scanned for any safe exits or hidden paths. He needed to ensure they had a backup plan. They couldn't rely on the hangar forever. As he moved down one of the dark corridors, the sound of footsteps echoed, just faint enough to seem like an afterthought. Daniel froze, instinctively reaching for his blaster. He listened carefully, then saw a shadow dart across the wall. Someone was here, and they weren't alone. He quickly crouched behind a rusted pillar, his blaster raised, ready. He wasn't about to be taken by surprise again. But the footsteps were getting closer, not hurried but deliberate. A voice called out from the shadows. "I see you, Carter." Daniel stiffened. The voice was familiar, too familiar. He had heard it before, during the war. A voice from his past, and one that had haunted him ever since. "I never thought I'd find you again, but it seems the stars have aligned." The voice stepped into the dim light, revealing a tall, heavily armored figure. "I see you found the princess. She's a valuable asset, Carter. Hand her over, and I'll make sure you both leave here in one piece." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. It was him, the mercenary leader who had been hunting them from the start. But this time, Daniel was ready. "We're not going anywhere," Daniel growled, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You're not taking her. Not this time." The mercenary leader smirked, his hand slowly reaching for his own weapon. "Then I guess we'll see about that, won't we?" The silence before the storm was deafening. Daniel's mind raced, but his body was calm. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for everything he had come to care about. And this time, he wouldn't let the past decide the future. The ship tore through space toward the military station on Titan's edge, its engines roaring with urgency. Daniel kept his hand steady on the controls, navigating through asteroid fields and dodging incoming enemy fire. But even with his skills, he knew they were running out of time. The mercenaries were closing in, and every passing moment brought them closer to danger. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Nyara asked, her voice tense as she watched the radar screen flicker. "No," Daniel replied, his voice grim. "And now they've got the upper hand. We've got a few tricks left, but it won't hold them off for long." Nyara clenched her fists. She had been running for so long, and now, finally, they were close to their destination. But it wasn't enough to guarantee safety. She had always felt like the universe was against her, but now, with Daniel by her side, she felt a spark of hope. Even if they didn't have a perfect plan, she wasn't going to let herself be caught without a fight. Suddenly, the ship jolted as a blast hit their shields. "Brace yourself," Daniel shouted. The ship veered sharply to the right, narrowly missing another shot. "We've got incoming fire from multiple directions," Nyara called out, scanning the approaching ships. "We need to keep them off us long enough to get to the station," Daniel said, his eyes scanning the controls for anything he could use. "Hold on." He pushed the ship into a tight turn, dodging another barrage of laser fire. The mercenaries were relentless, but Daniel's hands never wavered as he guided the ship through the chaos. Nyara, her heart pounding, reached for the weapons console, arming the ship with laser missiles. "We can't outrun them forever," she muttered, her gaze locked on the mercenaries closing in. "We need to fight." Daniel didn't hesitate. He knew the moment they made their move, they would be fully committed. With a quick glance at the radar, he said, "I'll hold them off for as long as I can. You take the shot when I give the signal." Nyara nodded, ready. She wasn't a soldier, but she had fought to survive. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. This was about staying free. And she wouldn't give up now. The mercenaries began to close in on them from all sides, their ships firing relentlessly. Daniel was quick, his mind focused on the movements of their attackers, calculating every possible outcome. One more hit like that, and they would be sitting ducks. He turned the ship hard to the left, sending the mercenaries off course. "Now," he shouted. Nyara fired the missile, watching as it streaked across space, hitting the lid ship with a sharp explosion. The ship shattered into a ball of flame and debris, but the fight was far from over. "We're not done yet," Daniel said, his voice steady as he looked out into the distance. The station was within reach now, but it was too close to call. Nayara felt a rush of adrenaline, pushing her fear aside. "Let's finish this." Another round of mercenary ships closed in. Daniel swerved and twisted the ship, evading the shots as much as possible. The old military station loomed ahead, but it wasn't just a place to hide. It was their last chance. If they could get inside, they might just survive. With one last push, Daniel guided the ship toward the station's docking bay. The mercenaries were close behind, but their weapons were out of range for now. As the ship glided into the hangar bay, the doors slammed shut behind them, and the ship came to a halt. They had made it. For the moment, they were safe. But only for now. The tension in the dimly lit hallway felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Daniel's hand tightened around his blaster, his eyes locked on the mercenary leader who stood a few meters away. The man's presence was as cold as his reputation, a reminder of everything Daniel had tried to escape. But now, in this moment, there was no more running. There was no more hiding. "You've come this far," the mercenary leader sneered, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. "But you won't make it out of here alive, Carter. Hand her over, and I'll let you walk away. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be." Daniel's grip on his blaster tightened, his jaw clenched. "I'll never hand her over," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling in his chest. "Not to you. Not to anyone." The leader's eyes narrowed, his smile turning cold. "Then you're making a big mistake." Before Daniel could react, the mercenary leader lunged, his weapon drawn in an instant. The move was fast, but Daniel was faster. He sidestepped, firing a single shot that hit the leader square in the shoulder. The mercenary stumbled back, roaring in pain but quickly recovering. "You'll regret that, Carter," he hissed, his voice filled with rage. Nayara, still inside the ship, heard the exchange. She didn't wait for a signal. Grabbing her blaster, she leaped from the ship and rushed down the narrow corridor. The station was eerily quiet, but the sound of blaster fire echoed through the halls. She wasn't about to let Daniel face this danger alone. As she approached the fight, she saw the mercenary leader closing in on Daniel. Without thinking, she raised her blaster and fired. The shot hit the mercenary's other shoulder, knocking him off balance. He staggered but didn't fall. "That's enough," Nayara shouted, stepping forward with determination. "I've had enough of being hunted." The mercenary leader growled, clearly in rage. "You don't know what you're messing with, girl." He charged again, but this time, Daniel was ready. With a swift movement, Daniel dodged the leader's wild swing and delivered a sharp blow to his chest, sending the mercenary crashing into a wall. The leader fell to the ground, struggling to rise. "It's over," Daniel said firmly, standing over him. The mercenary groaned, defeated. "You think you've won, Carter. There's more coming. You'll never escape them." Daniel didn't flinch. He had heard enough threats to last a lifetime. "Let them come." Nayara approached, her face fierce and unyielding. "We're done running," she said, her voice filled with both relief and resolve. She looked down at the mercenary leader, her eyes steely. "I'm taking control of my own future." The silence that followed was heavy, but in that silence, there was a sense of finality. The mercenary leader had been defeated, but they knew this wasn't the end of the road. There would be more battles to fight, more enemies to face. But now, they had each other. And together, they were ready for whatever came next. With the mercenary leader captured, Daniel turned to Nayara, offering her a small but genuine smile. "You did good." She returned the smile, her eyes shining with a mix of exhaustion and hope. "We did good." They made their way back to the ship, the battle behind them, but the future ahead still uncertain. Yet, for the first time in a long while, both felt a sense of peace. They had faced the darkness together, and now, they were ready to build something new. As the ship's engines hummed to life once more, Daniel and Nayara shared a glance, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The road ahead was still unknown, but one thing was certain: they wouldn't be walking it alone. Together, they would face whatever the future held. The quiet hum of the ship's engines was the only sound as they traveled deeper into the unknown regions of space. The stars outside flickered like distant beacons, but inside the ship, a tense silence had settled. Nayara sat at the control panel, her fingers tracing the display as she tried to figure out their next move. They couldn't stay on the run forever. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized just how much danger they were in. The bounty hunters weren't just after her, they were after both of them. "You can't keep running forever," she said, her voice low. "They'll find us eventually." Daniel didn't respond at first. He was sitting at the rear of the ship, cleaning his blaster rifle. His eyes were focused, but the tension in his posture was clear. "I know," he finally said, "but I'm not going to make it easy for them." Nayara turned in her seat, watching him. She had seen his skills in the fight back at the colony. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a survivor, and that made him someone she could trust. But even she knew there was only so much a single man could do. "We need to get somewhere they can't follow," Nayara said. "Somewhere hidden, somewhere no one knows about." Daniel's eyes met hers. He paused, thinking. "There's an old base on Titan's Edge," he said. "It's an abandoned military outpost, left behind after the war. It's remote and off the grid. If we can get there, we might have a chance to regroup and figure out our next move." Nayara nodded, her mind already working through the plan. She didn't know much about Titan's Edge, but she trusted Daniel. She would go wherever he led. The ship hummed louder as Daniel set a course for their new destination. They were already so deep in enemy territory, they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The hours passed in tense silence, only broken by the occasional check-in from the ship's systems. As they approached Titan's Edge, Daniel's hands were steady on the controls, but Nayara could sense the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They both knew they couldn't afford to let their guard down, not for a second. Suddenly, the ship's sensors blared. "We've got company," Daniel said grimly, his voice sharp. Nayara quickly turned to the console. A cluster of enemy ships appeared on the radar, closing in fast. "They must have tracked us here," Daniel muttered under his breath. "They knew we'd go to Titan's Edge." Nayara's eyes widened as the reality of their situation hit her. There was no escape this time. The mercenaries had found them, and this time, they were going to make sure they didn't get away. "Brace yourself," Daniel warned, gripping the controls tightly. "This is going to be a rough ride." With a flick of a switch, he activated the shields, and the ship shook as the first few enemy blasts hit their shields, rattling them both. Nayara could feel the pressure in her chest. The fight was on. "We're not going down without a fight," Daniel said, his voice filled with determination. "Get ready." Nayara grabbed a laser blaster from the weapons locker. She wasn't going to just sit there while Daniel fought for them. This was her fight too. The ship veered sharply to the right as Daniel dodged another blast, sending the enemy ships into a chaotic spin. They weren't going to make this easy for the mercenaries, but no matter how many times they dodged, the enemy was closing in. There was only one way out now. They had to fight their way through, or die trying. The door slammed shut behind Daniel and Nayara, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing outside. Daniel quickly scanned the room, his sharp eyes already calculating their options. The room was small, filled with old crates and dusty furniture, but it was enough for a brief fight. "Stay low," Daniel ordered, moving toward a corner of the room. He grabbed an old blaster rifle from a shelf and checked its power cells. The gun hummed to life, its sound strangely comforting. Nayara nodded, pressing herself into the shadows. She could feel her heart racing, but she pushed the fear aside. She had come here for a reason, to find him. And now that she had, she couldn't let this chance slip away. Outside, the footsteps stopped. A voice called out, rough and demanding. "We know you're in there, Carter. Come out, or we'll come in." Daniel clenched his jaw. Mercenaries. He could tell by the way they spoke, the confidence in their voices. They had been tracking Nyara, and now they knew she was here. "Who are they?" Nyara whispered, her violet eyes wide. "They're after you," Daniel replied, his voice low. "Probably hired by someone who doesn't want you to be found." "But I'm just a girl," she said, the confusion evident in her tone. "No, you're not just a girl." Daniel's voice was firm, sharp. "You're someone they'll do anything to capture." Nyara's stomach twisted. She knew what he meant. She wasn't just any alien girl. She was the heir to a throne, a royal target. But she had never imagined it would lead her to this moment, hiding from enemies with a man she barely knew. Outside, the mercenaries exchanged quiet words, and then they began to move toward the door. A countdown to danger. Daniel looked at Nyara. "I'm not letting them take you." Before she could reply, he was already at the door, opening it just a crack to peek outside. The air was thick with tension. Nyara's pulse quickened. "On 3, Daniel whispered, "Get ready." He counted down silently in his head. Then, with a sudden movement, he swung the door open, aiming his blaster at the nearest mercenary. The shot rang out with a loud crack, sending the man stumbling back. The rest of the mercenaries rushed in, weapons drawn. Nyara didn't hesitate. She wasn't just a helpless bystander. She had spent years learning to survive. And now, in this moment, she was ready. With quick, fluid movements, she grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and swung it toward the nearest mercenary, knocking him off balance. Daniel fired again, and another mercenary fell. The fight was chaotic, a mix of alien agility and human military precision. But just as it seemed they had the upper hand, the door burst open wider. A towering figure stepped through, larger than the others, with glowing eyes and a massive weapon strapped to his back. "Carter," the figure bellowed, "you should have stayed out of this." Daniel's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just any mercenary. This was the leader. "You're not getting her," Daniel said coldly. "Not today." Nyara could see the tension in his face, the years of fighting, the weight of decisions he had made. And she realized then, as the fight raged on, that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was a battle for both of them.